For the month of October, we are looking at the book of Ephesians, and we're just kind of going through this book and really trying to get a big picture of what Paul is writing here. And one thing that we have to understand about this is not Paul saying, hey, I'm going to write a book for Christians everywhere to understand. What he was doing here is he was writing very specifically to a church that was dealing with some very specific things. And this church was, I think, very near and dear to Paul's heart because of some stuff that went on. And one of the things that happened when Paul went to this church, the first time he went to the church in Ephesus, he went there and started preaching about Jesus, and there was a riot. Like, people threw a tantrum. It was crazy. Things got out of control. They were threatening to throw people in jail. They were in this big amphitheater, and Paul was like, I want to go in there, and I want to help my people. And then people were telling Paul, hey, don't go in there. They're going to throw you in jail too. And it was just this big thing. And I want to read just a little short reason why these people were so upset, and you find that in Acts 19. So Acts 19 tells us what happened in Ephesus when Paul went there the first time and he was preaching the gospel to these people. So Acts 19, I'm going to start at verse 24. So this is right after Paul and his friends are preaching the gospel, and it says, about that time there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business for the craftsmen. He called them together along with the workmen in related trades and said, men, you know we receive a good income from this business, and you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that man-made gods are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia, and the world will be robbed of her divine majesty. Paul was upsetting their culture. When Jesus came into this culture, he was just blowing things up. It actually hurt their economy. The message of Jesus was hurting their economy. People were afraid they're going to lose their jobs. They made these silver shrines and statues of this goddess, Artemis, and people would come and buy them, and that was a huge part of their economy. And it's kind of funny how the guy phrases it. He's like, hey, they're taking our money. Also, you know, there's like our religion too. It's kind of like, that was like the second thing that he thought about. Like, also, Artemis is real, so we should be worried about that. But he's worried about these two things: their economy, their jobs, their security. And he's also very worried about their way of life, their religion. This fellow Paul is coming and saying, hey, these are no gods at all, these statues that you're worshiping. And he was just disrupting all this stuff. Now, I want to take a quick look at this goddess, Artemis. Artemis was the main goddess. Actually, one of the ancient wonders of the world was the temple of Artemis. It was this huge temple in Ephesus where people would come from all around and go to worship this goddess, and they would buy these things for shrines and statues and all this stuff. It was a huge business, but it was also the main goddess. This was the main person that they were worshiping. They had many gods, the Greek gods, but Artemis was the one that they were very focused on. Now, Artemis also has a Roman equivalent. So if you're into Greek mythology or Roman mythology at all, you know that Greek gods and Roman gods are often, there's equivalents here. So her Roman equivalent is named Diana. So we have Artemis, Greek goddess, Diana, Roman goddess. And so she actually was in many different cultures, this same goddess. And actually, in our culture today, she's actually still worshipped under a different name. Wonder Woman. She is Wonder Woman. Artemis, and really, I'm going to get a little bit comic book nerdy on you real quick here for a second. In the Wonder Woman timeline, the comic, there's actually two characters. There's Artemis and there's Diana. They're two separate characters. Historically, we're talking about the same goddess, but in the comic, she comes out as two people. But if you want to get really comic book nerdy, Artemis at one point in the comic actually takes up the Wonder Woman mantle, and Artemis is Wonder Woman for a time, but Diana's not during that time. Anyway, this was the goddess they worshipped. You guys are with me? Yeah, John and Vanessa are with me. This is who they worshipped, Wonder Woman. Nerd, yeah. They worshipped basically the goddess that they worshipped, and of course there were differences. In every culture, Artemis was represented a little bit differently. In our culture, she's represented really as Wonder Woman. And if you've seen that movie, you saw the island with all the Amazons, is what they call all the women. The Amazons are actually something that in Greek mythology, in their religion that they had, this was a very real thing. The Amazons were a very real people. These Greek goddesses were very real people to them. And so what I want us to do is sort of begin to understand the culture that they were living in. Their culture was very different from ours. A lot of times we think of cultures like just very like single-mindedly, kind of just linear, when it's very complex. There are very different things going on. So there can be a situation where women are feeling very empowered, but at the same time you have men that are the more like educated. And that's kind of what was going on in this culture, is you did have some very empowered women. And I just want to get across the effect that a female goddess, when that is the primary in a culture, I want to get across a little bit of the effect that might have on a culture. So what I did is I looked up some tweets about what happened when people went and saw the movie Wonder Woman. Right? So this is how we respond in our culture to the goddess. And remember, this isn't even real. To them, this was a very real thing. But I want you to understand how empowering and how much effect that even a movie with this female goddess can have on people. So the first one, I'm just going to read through these. If you're a tweeter and you really want to know like who tweeted all these, just come see me and I'll hook you up with whatever. I'm just going to read through the tweets, though. First one, still blown away that women watching Wonder Woman are feeling something we've never felt before. Heart, representation matters. The next one, I really didn't expect Wonder Woman to impact me the way it did, but seeing a confident, powerful woman save the day was really beautiful. Cried a few times, specifically when a young girl in my screening emphatically declared, yes, seeing Diana represent fortitude. Took 3 12-year-old girls to Wonder Woman. They are literally vibrating with empowerment. It was awesome. Bravo. This one might take a little bit of explaining for some of you. But this one says, for women of my generation, the resonance of casting Robin Wright as the most powerful Amazon cannot be overstated. Now, real quick, to just catch you up on some actresses in here, Robin Wright was, in this movie, she was the most powerful goddess, right? She's Wonder Woman's mom. She's super powerful and super awesome. The actress that portrayed her was also Princess Buttercup in The Princess Bride. So what they were seeing, what this person is saying is, when I was a little girl, I saw this woman as the helpless princess that needed rescuing. And then when I grew up, she's taking on this role, and she's this powerful, awesome woman. And she's saying, you can't overstate what that means to my generation. I really like this one. Hospitals should play Wonder Woman in birthing rooms. Quick background on the movie. There's a place that they refer to no man's land. It's a war zone. And this person says, when Wonder Woman steps into no man's land, men behind saying she can't, men ahead blocking her way, and she keeps moving forward. The next one, the plot of Wonder Woman. Men saying, you can't do that. Wonder Woman, what? Men, you cannot. Wonder Woman, I did it already, fixed everything. All the dudes in Wonder Woman say, Diana, no. Diana says, Diana, yes. Are you feeling a little bit of a shift in what's in the responses here? Now we're going to get a much bigger shift. I can't wait to go up to every guy in the theater for Wonder Woman and condescendingly ask if they're just here with their girlfriend. Wonder Woman got me out here ready to fight a dude with my forearms. All caps, and just for those of you that are not like super into like social media and stuff, when you're in all caps, it's like yelling, right? This is shouting. No wonder men are so obscenely confident all the time. I saw one woman hero movie and I'm ready to fight 1,000 dudes barehanded. Do you see there's two very distinct responses here? One is one of just sheer empowerment, like, wow, I can do stuff. I can do stuff. The other one is, take that, men, right? So there's one of empowerment and then there's one of animosity. And just to be like really honest with you, when I first read even some of the ones with empowerment, my first thought was, well, why don't you be inspired by women who have done real things, right? Like there are women out there, are awesome women who are alive now and all through history who have done awesome things. Be inspired by them. Like Wonder Woman's just pretend. But then honestly, I got a little convicted because I thought back to me jumping around in my underoos being like, superheroes are inspiring. You put that in the context of this is their very real goddess. And understand what that does to an entire culture. It has an effect on a culture. While we've been going through this book of Ephesians, here's kind of how the book flows. First, Paul spends a significant amount of time, like 2.5 chapters, telling this church in Ephesus, listen, God loves you deeply. Before time began, God had not forgotten about you. His plan all along, even though we look back in history and God's chosen people are the Jews, God's plan all along was to open his family up to you in Ephesus. He planned this. He loves you deeply. What Paul is saying there is, hey, welcome to this family. You are children of God. And then he talks about how fulfilling it is to know the love of Jesus. Because God is this loving, because Jesus Christ laid down his life for you, you can be filled with the fullness of God. And I love that saying. Paul says that. You can be filled with the fullness of God, and the way you get that is knowing the love of Christ beyond knowledge. It means experiencing God's love. And here's the beautiful thing. The worse we've been, sometimes we look at, man, the worse we've been, I'm just like I'm ashamed and I'm guilty. Listen, the worse you've been, the more that proves God's love for you. It's proof. God is so loving and so forgiving and so accepting. And this is where Paul says, we're saved by grace through faith, not a result of our works. What that means is that no matter what we've done, no matter what we do, if we put our faith in Jesus Christ, if you truly believe that he's your Savior, you're in the family. You're secure here. You're safe here. You're loved here. Your identity is defined by what Jesus Christ has done for you. Welcome to this family. And last week we looked at where Paul shifted gears a little bit, because then he starts going into the way that we behave. He says, therefore, because he just finished telling them how loving and great God is and how accepted and loved they are. You're fully loved, you're accepted. Therefore, stop doing these things that you're doing. Stop being sexually immoral. Stop fighting with one another. Love each other. Have unity with one another. Care for one another. Be kind. Because Jesus Christ is kind to you. And then today we're going to get into a rather controversial, it's about to get real quiet. It's already kind of quiet in here. It's about to get tense in here. We're going to get into this section where Paul says something, and it's had a great effect on us, and it has a great effect on the church. And I want you to imagine writing this into the Wonder Woman culture. Okay, we've already kind of imagined what their culture might be like. He has this saying, right? And you're probably familiar with it. He says, "Wives, submit to your husbands." Now that statement's carrying quite a bit of like oomph with it now, right? You see Paul is saying this into this culture. It's a big deal. Wives, submit to your husbands. And this is a tough thing to study because there's many, many views on this. And understand in our culture, out there are egomaniacs, controlling people, not quite right up here. They get a hold of something like this, and that's where we get like a polygamous cult. Right? You guys with me on that? You're the wrong person, this power-hungry person gets a hold of something like this, and he's like, oh, I'm going to collect a bunch of wives and have them all submit to me. Right? We can see where this can go way wrong. But also, listen, what we want to do, what we never want to do is go like, oh, well, we're going to take this verse and shove it off to the side and we don't obey that. No, we want to be obedient to what God teaches us. We want to follow the Bible. We want to do these things. We want to be the people. We want to live the way that God designed things to work. We want to live that way. We want to follow. We want to be obedient. But we also can see how if we get it wrong, it squashes empowerment and breeds animosity. And that's not the goal of what Paul's saying here. You can see there was a very positive reaction to this Wonder Woman movie, right? Feeling empowered, yes. There was also that one of animosity. Like, I'm going to go tell these men something. I'm glad there's no video running this week. Thanks for not bringing the camera this week, Rob. Yeah. But as you study this verse, it's let me tell you, this has been something that's been rather blurry, because what we do sometimes we go, well, we don't want to be disobedient, but we also know that this can't be out of control. We know it doesn't mean like, you better do whatever I tell you. I've been joking with my wife a little bit this week. I've been working on this, she has not appreciated my jokes very much. But as we study this, it's going to get very, very clear. And there's one thing that's super clear that I think is going to really bring some of this into focus. Because a lot of times what we do is we try to define a good marriage as, well, a good marriage is defined by a submissive wife. And you do that and you have a godly marriage and you're good to go. Paul has a lot more to say. A lot more to say on the subject of husbands and wives. And he also talks about children and parents. He talks about slaves and masters. Real quick with slaves and masters, this has also been used to condone slavery. The Bible actually, for a very long time, has had a very strong stance against slavery. In this culture in Ephesus, there were actually different types of slavery. Like, we see it as a very clear-cut thing, like slave, not slave. In their culture, it was kind of like they had slavery, like we know historical slavery. They also had something called bondservants, where people owed money. So they said, hey, I'm going to come be your slave until I can work off this money. And then there were also servants, and sometimes the word for slave and servants was used interchangeably. There were people who had a job, you go to work, you do your job, you come home. But over 3,000 years ago, I want you to see God's view of slavery as we know slavery in our culture. Exodus 21:16 says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. God does not approve of slavery. All right, we clear on that? Good. Moving on. Wives and husbands. I want us to look at this verse, and just to let you in a little bit of the way I study throughout the week. A lot of times if there's a word like this, like it's very clear, wives, husbands. Some verses, some translations in the Bible say, wives, be subject to your husbands. And it's a tough thing. So when you look at the Greek, there's a Greek translation, and I use, when I want to get Greek meanings, like what does this word submit really mean? I use what's called an interlinear Bible. Actually, the one I use the most is called the Mounce Reverse Interlinear Bible. And what that does is it gives you English and it gives you Greek, like side by side. So you see the English word and you see the Greek words. And sometimes it's like English word and 2 Greek words, or it's a Greek word and 2 English words, because you have to do that to translate. You guys are all familiar with translating and how that kind of works with different languages. But in Greek, this is how it works. And so in this, it goes like this. It goes wives, and you get the Greek word for wives. And over here, it says to your husbands, and under here it says to your husbands in Greek. And then right under this word submit or be subject to is a big blank. It's a big blank. There's no Greek word there. Blank. The very literal translation of this is wives to your husbands. Now, it's not because somebody smudged something or somebody cut it out or the writers of the Bible added something that should never be there. But the way that Paul wrote it, that verse literally goes wives to your husbands. And the reason it looks like that is because Paul, in this verse, is referencing something that he said the verse before. So we find that in Ephesians 5:22. If you go back one verse to Ephesians 5:21, we're going to make this whole idea of submitting. It's going to get very, very clear. So if you have your Bibles, Ephesians 5, not verse 22, we're going to start at verse 21. Verse 21 says this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see, at this point, Paul's talking to everyone. He's talking to the church. He's talking to the men, the women, the leaders, the not leaders. He's talking to the church. He's speaking to us. And he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, a lot of times we have this word submit, and we try to define it within the context of only wives submit to your husbands, but let's try to define it in its original context, because the way that Paul wrote this went more like this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives to your husbands. You see, this thing of wives submitting to husbands, it was not an exclusive command for wives. It was falling under this umbrella of, hey, submit to one another. Under this, hey, wives, to your husbands. Why are the wives the first one that he calls out? Because animosity. Because lack of respect. Because the Wonder Woman culture. Because in that culture, there was a very positive thing of empowerment. There was also a very negative thing of animosity. What he was saying here is not only you wives. He was saying, hey, women, you're included in this. So let's define this word not by when he's talking to women, but when he's talking to all of us. How do you submit to one another? Does it mean you all have to do what each other always says? That would be a little bit of a nightmare. Does it mean you guys all work together, but one another gets the final say? It doesn't fit. What's Paul getting at here? He's saying serve each other. Count one another as more important than yourselves. Look to the interests of others, not only to your own. Love your neighbor as yourself. Submit to those around you. Submit to serving. Submit to humility. Stop playing this game where you're trying to get up above, because we do that in our culture today. That is the game. I'm going to get here, and then I'm going to get here, and then I'm going to get here, and I'm going to be in control. And Paul is saying, stop this. Stop this control game and submit to one another. Your life should be the opposite of always trying to get ahead. You should be the servant of all. And he continues. So let's put this in context. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. I'm going to stop right there for a second. What is he saying to wives? He's saying, hey, serve your husbands. Put his needs above your own. Notice he doesn't say, hey, husbands, make sure you submit your wives. Right? When I think of the word submit, often I think of like mixed martial arts, right? Like you're fighting and you put somebody in an arm bar and they tap out. That's called submitting them, right? So this is a very, very far cry from what Paul's saying here. He's not saying make sure your wives submit. The direction to the wives is wives, submit to your husbands. He's saying serve, love, put his needs above your own. And then he moves on to the husbands. And he says, in this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. You see, he's not dealing with exclusive commands here. He says, husbands, love your wives. Does that mean that wives don't have to love husbands? Of course not. He says, wives, respect your husbands. Does that mean that husbands don't have to respect wives? Of course not. We understand that. He's speaking to some very specific problems that are going on here. Wives who were not respectful of their husbands in this culture. We see a lot of that in our culture. If you watch TV, most of the kids shows that are on today, man, fathers are just a joke. Our culture has turned fathers into the butt of a joke. Go home and turn on the Disney Channel and watch just about any show, and every single father that's on every show, just about everyone, I can almost guarantee that they're going to be dumb. Fathers have no idea what they're talking about. It's a direct attack on the family. I don't think everybody that's involved in that means it to be a direct attack. I think a lot of people have good intentions of just wanting to produce a good, funny show. But it comes out, and husbands are pushed down. That's probably something similar to what was happening in this culture. Husbands, not quite as important, because Artemis, right? Our culture's a little bit different. We have mostly men superheroes. We have God the Father. It's very easy for a woman to feel like less, to lose empowerment, to build animosity. And too often we try to define marriage by this one thing, wives, submit. And really what Paul's saying here is not, he's not trying to define who's in control and who gets to say what. What Paul is saying here is that whoever you are, whatever your position, whoever your relationship is with, wherever you are, master, slave, child, father, mother, wife, husband, whoever you are, serve, submit to one another. Put the needs of others above your own. Now, of course, we have different roles. Paul says here the husband is the head. And that can become very clear because he says the husband is the head as Christ is the head of the church. What does that mean? Well, let's think about what Christ is to us. We serve Christ because we love him. What has he done for us? Jesus Christ, as the head of the church, gave himself up, submitted himself to death on a cross for his bride. What Paul's saying to husbands here is really the same thing he's saying to wives. He's saying, put her needs above your own. Serve, love, stop being so selfish. Be the head, lead in love, lead in serving. You set the example not by taking this head, but by doing it the way that Jesus did it. And say, I'm going to give myself up. I'm going to put you ahead of myself. We see when Paul goes on and he talks about children and parents, he says, children, obey your parents. That tells us when Paul means obey, he just says obey. If the relationship was obey, he very easily could have just said, hey, make sure you're obeying. It's not what he says. He says submit to one another. Jesus Christ sacrificed himself to the point of death, gave himself up. That's what Paul is telling the husbands here. And I want you to think about this. A marriage where you're always trying to figure out who's in charge and where's the line there, there's some tension there. You are bound to lose empowerment. You are bound to build animosity on both sides. Because you have a husband who's going like, well, you're overstepping your bounds. And you have a wife that's saying, well, you don't let me do anything or what I want to do. Or if we submit to one another, here's what you have, is you have a marriage where you have a husband that says, hey, I'm going to put your needs ahead of mine. Whatever I do is for you. My decisions are made in your best interest. And then on the other side, you have a wife who says, I'm here to serve you. How do you go wrong? When you have two people who are committed to serving one another, you can't go wrong. And that line of who's in charge and who gets to do it gets very clear. It gets very clear. When your goal is to serve, your goal is to submit to one another. And listen, we can't create our own definition for this word. We have to use it in the context of submit to one another. So however we define this word submit, this has to be something that we can do to one another. If Paul says submit to one another, this is something that we must be able to do to one another. It's starting to get a little more clear. Serve, love, put their interests ahead of yours. When you are filled with God, when you are finding your identity and your satisfaction in Him, you are then equipped to go and serve. I want to tell just a real quick story. Ulysses S. Grant, one of the greatest generals and presidents that our country has seen. Basically won the Civil War, right, for the North. At his time, he became the youngest president ever. He was a great man. There was a time where he was walking down a street, and he was going to a reception in his honor, right? Hey, we're having a party for Grant. And he's walking, and it starts to rain. He pulls out his umbrella, and he's walking. There's a gentleman walking with him who didn't have an umbrella, so he shares his umbrella, right? He serves. He does the kind thing. Hey, share my umbrella. And as they're walking to this reception, the guy walking with them, he says, I've always thought Grant is a much overrated man. I want you to think about what would somebody who's insecure, not experiencing the love of God, what would somebody who's empty inside do? Oh, I'm going to put this guy in his place. You know what Grant did? Is he said one of the most awesome things. He says, that is my view also. Beautiful. It's beautiful. He was serving. He was loving. And he's saying, yeah, like it's not about trying to do this and do this. It's about serving. It's about loving. At the beginning of chapter 5, Paul says this, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children. You're part of this family. And live a life of love just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Put the needs of others ahead of your own. Look out for the interests of others. Love your neighbor as yourself. You see, the Bible does not afford us the option for abuse, for ego, for animosity. If you're feeling like your role, not just in marriage, but in your work, in any relationship, if it's getting blurry, we can bring it into focus by asking this. Am I trying to get ahead of this person? Am I trying to push somebody down, or am I trying to lower myself and serve? Am I submitting to those around me? Am I looking out for their needs? Am I loving? Am I kind? Am I putting them ahead of myself? That's what Paul means when he says, submit to one another. Put the needs of others ahead of yourselves. Be a servant as Christ has served you. That's how Jesus leads us, and it's a beautiful thing. God loves, accepts, gives. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. I hope that's made these things come into focus a little bit. It can release some tension when we get the word and we understand what these things mean in context. Love, submit, serve one another. Pray with me.